Edgar Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He walked into the county clerk's office that Tuesday morning like he owned the building, dropped a leather folder on the desk, and told the clerk to file the papers before noon. The paper said his niece, Clara Whitmore, was mentally unfit to manage her own affairs. They said she needed a guardian. They said that guardian should be him. He said it all without blinking, without hesitation, without a single flicker of shame, the way a man speaks when he's been planning something for a very long time and finally decided the waiting is done. Clara was 32 years old. She had managed her father's accounts since she was 19. She had never once been late on a tax payment, never once let a contract lapse, never once asked Edgar Voss for a single thing. And now he was trying to take everything. If this were happening to you, if the person who smiled at your father's funeral was the same person filing papers to call you incompetent, what would you do? If you've ever watched someone use the law like a weapon against the people who trusted them, you already know how this story feels. Stay with me, subscribe to this channel, and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, because what she does next is something I don't want you to miss. And while you're here, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all changed, Clara Whitmore had been awake since before 4. Not because she was anxious, though she was. Not because she had a plan, though she was working on one. She was awake because the house her father built felt different in the dark than it did in daylight. And lately she'd been spending a lot of time in the dark, sitting at his old desk, reading through papers she'd already read 100 times, trying to find something she might have missed. She found it on a Tuesday, 3 days before the court hearing. It was a single line in the county property index, buried under a list of routine transfers from 1871. The handwriting wasn't her father's. She knew her father's handwriting the way she knew the shape of his hands. Broad, unhurried, the letters leaning slightly to the right. This handwriting was different, smaller, cramped at the edges. Like whoever wrote it was trying to take up as little space as possible, hoping no one would look too closely. Clara looked closely. She sat at that desk for 2 hours with a candle burning low beside her, cross-referencing the line against 4 other documents, checking dates, checking names, checking the seal on the bottom of the page. By the time the candle burned out, she knew 2 things with certainty. First, the document was a forgery. Second, it had Edgar's fingerprints all over it. Not literally, but in every other way that mattered. She sat in the dark for a long moment after that. The house was quiet. Outside, a horse shifted in the corral. A barn owl called once, twice, then went silent. Clara pressed her palms flat against the desk and breathed. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had learned that from her mother, who had learned it from hers. Whitmore women didn't cry in the dark. They made decisions. She made one. Oh, she knew about Wyatt Callahan, the way most people in Harlan County knew about him, by reputation first, and then by occasional sight. He ran Lone Ridge Ranch, 12 miles north of town, and he ran it alone. Not because he had no help. He had 2 ranch hands, Elias and Mara Boone, a married couple who'd worked the property for years. But because he didn't invite people in. Not to the ranch, not to his business, and certainly not to his personal life. People respected him. They just didn't know him. What Clara knew about Wyatt Callahan was specific, and she'd been thinking about it for the past hour. She knew he was honest because she'd seen him turn down a land offer from Edgar 3 years ago, had heard from the clerk's assistant that Edgar had gone back twice with higher numbers, and Wyatt had said no both times without explanation. She knew he was fair because 2 of her father's former employees had gone to work at Lone Ridge and had never complained, not once, about how they were treated. She knew he was unmarried because the whole county knew that. It came up at every church social and every town meeting in the particular way that a lone man's status always becomes community property eventually. She also knew he was going to think she was out of her mind. She saddled her own horse just before sunrise. She didn't pack much. A folder of documents. A change of clothes rolled tight and tied to the back of the saddle. The small knife her father had given her when she turned 20, which she wore at her hip more out of habit than necessity. The ride to Lone Ridge took just under 2 hours in the cold. The light was barely gray when she turned up the long dirt track that led to the ranch house. And by the time she reached the gate, the sun was coming up behind the hills in that low, flat way it did in early spring. More suggestion than warmth. She sat on her horse at the gate for a moment. It was not too late to turn around. She turned up the track. Wyatt Callahan heard her coming before he saw her. He was already up. He was always already up, standing at the well in the side yard, drawing water for the morning. He heard the hoofbeats on the frozen ground, counted them, identified them as a single horse moving at a cautious trot, and straightened up to look. A woman, riding alone, at this hour. He set the water bucket down and waited. She stopped her horse at the edge of the yard and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. He looked back at her. She had dark circles under her eyes and mud on her boots, and a folder of papers tucked under her left arm. And she was holding herself very straight in the saddle, the way people do when they're trying hard not to show that their hands are shaking. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "That's me. My name is Clara Whitmore. My father was Thomas Whitmore. He owned 49 acres along the Clearwater Creek Basin before he died 2 years ago." She paused. "I own it now." Wyatt waited. He could tell she wasn't done. "My uncle Edgar Voss has filed papers with the county court claiming I'm incompetent to manage my own property. The hearing is in 3 days. If the court agrees with him, and right now there's a real chance they will, he takes control of everything my father spent his life building." She stopped again. Her jaw was tight. "I need a husband, Mr. Callahan. Not for love, not for company. I need one because a married woman's property rights are different from an unmarried one's in this territory. And right now that difference is the only legal ground I have to stand on." Wyatt said nothing for several seconds. He picked up the water bucket and walked to the trough by the fence and poured it in. He set the bucket down. He looked at it. "Yes," he said. Clara blinked. What?" "I said yes." He looked up at her. "Come inside. You look like you've been riding in the cold since before dawn, and we need to talk through the details before we ride to the clerk's office." She stared at him. She had prepared arguments. She had rehearsed the case she needed to make, structured it the way her father had taught her to structure any negotiation. Strongest points first, anticipated objections covered, emotional appeal held in reserve. She had been ready to fight for his agreement. "You haven't heard the terms," she said. "I know what it means to be Thomas Whitmore's daughter," Wyatt said, already moving toward the porch steps. "And I know what Edgar Voss is." He stopped at the door and looked back at her. "You coming in?" "What?" The inside of the ranch house surprised her. She'd expected something austere. The home of a man alone usually had that particular quality. Functional, sparse, everything in its place but nothing unnecessary. And the house was orderly, that much was true. But there were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, well-worn ones with cracked spines, and there was a decent piece of ironwork hanging over the mantel that someone had made with real care, and the table in the kitchen had 4 chairs around it instead of 1. Mara Boone was already in the kitchen when they came in. She looked at Clara without surprise, which either meant she was a person who took unexpected morning visitors in stride, or she'd already spotted Clara coming up the track and had prepared herself. Clara suspected the latter. "Coffee," Mara said. It was not a question. "Please," Clara said. Wyatt pulled out a chair and sat down and nodded for Clara to do the same. She sat. She put her folder of papers on the table between them. He didn't reach for them immediately, which she noted. "Tell me about the forged document," he said. She blinked again. "How did you know there was one?" "Because Edgar doesn't do anything without paper behind it. He learned that from your father, actually. Thomas was meticulous about documentation, always had everything in writing. Edgar watched and paid attention." A brief pause. "He just uses the same tool for different purposes." Clara had not expected that. She had not expected any of this, if she was being honest. She'd expected resistance, negotiation, suspicion, the ordinary skepticism of a man being asked to bind himself legally to a stranger before breakfast. She had not expected someone who already understood the machinery of what Edgar was doing. She opened the folder and slid the document across the table. Wyatt read it. He read slowly, which she respected. He didn't skim. He went back to the top once, checked something in the middle of the page, looked at the seal at the bottom for a long moment. "This was filed in 1871, he said. "Yes." "But your father purchased that property in 1869. "Yes." "So whoever wrote this was trying to create a claim that predated the purchase but dated from after." He stopped. "They weren't careful enough with the timeline." "No," Clara said. "They weren't." Wyatt put the document down and looked at her. "This is enough to challenge the claim, But it's not enough by itself. A judge can be convinced a filing date is a clerical error. You'd need to show a pattern. I have 4 other documents, Clara said. All of them show the same handwriting. All of them involve land transfers that benefit someone connected to Edgar, either directly or through a land agent named Silas Crow. She watched something shift in Wyatt's expression. It was slight, the particular stillness of a man who has just heard a name he recognizes. Silas Crow, he repeated. You know him. I've met him. Wyatt picked up his coffee cup and held it without drinking from it. He came here about 18 months ago, said he was representing a private investment group interested in Northern Range properties, asked me what I'd take for the Eastern 40. What did you tell him? I told him it wasn't for sale. And? He came back twice more. A pause. Third time he showed up with a document claiming there was a disputed boundary on that section. Tried to convince me I didn't actually own the full 40. Wyatt set the cup down. I told him to get off my land. Clara was quiet for a moment. Did you keep the document he brought? Wyatt looked at her steadily. I did. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief. It was too early for relief. But the first small opening in a wall she'd been trying to get through for weeks. That document, she said carefully, might be connected to the same pattern I've been tracing through the county records. If Crow was working for Edgar when he came to you, if there's a record of that relationship, it changes the nature of what Edgar is doing. It stops being a family dispute about my competence and starts being something much larger. Wyatt was quiet. Land fraud, he said. Yes. Outside the kitchen window, the sun had fully cleared the hills now. Elias Boone was crossing the yard toward the barn, his breath visible in the cold air. Mara refilled Clara's coffee without being asked, which Clara noticed and felt grateful for in the distant, automatic way of a person whose mind is mostly somewhere else. You didn't just come here for a husband, Wyatt said. It was not an accusation. He said it the way someone says something when they're working out the full shape of a thing. I came here because the marriage solves the immediate problem, Clara said. It buys me time and changes my legal standing before the hearing. But you're right that there's more to it. She met his eyes. If what I think is true, if Crow has been working this same scheme across multiple properties in the county, then Edgar isn't just after my land. He's been building something, and the only way to stop it is to prove the whole structure, not just the piece that touches me. Wyatt was quiet for a long time, long enough that Clara began to think she'd misjudged him, that this was the moment he'd tell her it was too complicated, that he'd agreed to a simple arrangement and this was no longer simple, that he had his own ranch to think about. My document from Crow is in the lockbox in the office, he said. We'll need a copy made before we go to the clerk. The original stays here. Clara let out a breath she hadn't fully realized she was holding. There's something else you should know, she said. About why I came to you specifically. He waited. 3 years ago, when Edgar tried to buy your Eastern 40, he told me about it afterward. He was angry you'd refused. He said, she stopped, chose her words. He said you were stubborn and difficult and that you'd regret it. He was already positioning that property as part of something he was planning. When you refused, it interrupted his timeline. Wyatt absorbed this. So I'm already on his list. You were already on his list, Clara said. I just thought you should know that helping me isn't a neutral act. If Edgar finds out, when Edgar finds out, Wyatt said. When Edgar finds out, she corrected, he will come at you too, not just me. Wyatt Callahan looked at the woman sitting across his kitchen table, the daughter of a man he'd respected, with dark circles under her eyes and mud on her boots, and the evidence of a conspiracy laid out in a leather folder in front of her. And he said nothing for a moment. Then, let's go get Elias and Mara. If they're going to be witnesses, they need to know what they're witnessing. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took 20 minutes. The justice of the peace in Harlan County was a man named Aldous Webb, who had been performing the function for 11 years and had long since stopped being surprised by anything. He looked at Clara and Wyatt across his desk, looked at Elias and Mara standing behind them, and looked at the clock on the wall. You have the filing fee? He asked. Yes, Wyatt said. Any objections from either party? No, said Clara. All right then. It was done in the time it took the morning to warm up by 2 degrees. Afterwards, standing on the steps of the courthouse with the certificate in Clara's hands, Mara Boone touched her arm briefly, just a light touch, nothing more, and said, "You're going to be all right." Clara looked at her. Mara was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. "I know," Clara said, and surprised herself by believing it. Wyatt was already at the horses, checking the saddle straps with the methodical attention of someone who defaults to physical tasks when he's thinking hard about something. Clara walked over and stood beside him for a moment. "I'll pull my weight," she said. "At the ranch, I mean. I'm not going to be a burden." He glanced at her sideways. "I didn't think you would be." "I just wanted to say it." "You already said it by coming 12 miles in the cold with a folder full of evidence instead of waiting for someone to save you." He tightened the strap on the saddle. "I don't need you to say it again." She didn't. They rode back to Lone Ridge together, and the sun climbed higher, and the cold began very slowly, reluctantly, to give way. But Clara knew. Even as the warmth started to reach her shoulders and the horse settled into a comfortable rhythm beneath her, that the hearing was still 3 days away, that Edgar's papers were already filed, that Silas Crow was somewhere out there, and the pattern she'd uncovered was bigger than one woman's inheritance, and she had only just begun to understand how deep it went. The man riding beside her had said yes before he heard the whole story. She didn't know yet whether that made him brave or reckless. She suspected before long she was going to find out. The certificate was folded and tucked inside Clara's coat by the time they rode back through the gate at Lone Ridge, and it stayed there for the rest of that first day like something fragile she wasn't quite ready to set down. Mara had lunch on the table by the time they unsaddled the horses. Beans and salt pork and cornbread, nothing elaborate, but Clara ate 2 full servings without noticing she'd done it, until she was already reaching for a third piece of bread. She'd forgotten to eat breakfast. She'd forgotten to eat dinner the night before, come to think of it. The past week had had that particular quality of crisis, where the body stops sending its ordinary signals and you run on something rawer and less reliable until the crisis either breaks or breaks you. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," Mara said, not making a thing of it. "I put fresh linens on this morning." Clara looked at her. "You knew I was coming?" Mara glanced at Wyatt. Wyatt was looking at his plate. "Elias saw you on the track," Mara said, "before you reached the gate. We had time." Clara absorbed this. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or slightly unnerved. She settled on relieved because unnerved was a luxury she couldn't afford at the moment. "Thank you," she said. After lunch, Wyatt spread the documents across the kitchen table. Clara's folder and his own papers from the lockbox, the ones Silas Crow had brought on that third visit 18 months ago. Elias sat at the far end of the table, not because he'd been invited specifically, but because he'd simply pulled out a chair and sat down, and nobody told him otherwise. Mara stood at the counter and listened while appearing to do something else entirely with a pot and a rag. Clara laid the documents out in sequence, not by date, by type. All the forged property claims in one group, all the land agent records in another. Crow's document from Wyatt's lockbox she set slightly apart, at the top, because it was the cleanest link between the local scheme and a name she kept seeing in the county index that she hadn't been able to attach to anything until now. "There's a holding company," she said, listed as the beneficiary on 3 of these transfers. Meridian Land and Development. I've been trying to find a registration on it for a week, and I can't, because it doesn't appear to be registered in Montana Territory under that name. "But it's registered somewhere," Wyatt said. "I think so. And I think if we find where, we find something that connects Crow to Edgar directly, not just as an agent working similar territory, but as partners." Elias cleared his throat. He was a broad, quiet man, the kind who spoke rarely and usually had something worth saying when he did. "There's a man in Billings," he said, "used to work for the Territorial Land Office before he retired, keeps records of his own. Private copies he made before he left." He looked at Clara. "My wife's cousin worked for him for 2 years. He's not a friendly man, but he's honest, and he's got no love for the kind of arrangement you're describing. If this Meridian Company registered anywhere in the territory between 1868 and 1876, he'd have a copy of the paperwork." Clara looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Elias. "How far is Billings?" Clara asked. "Day-and-a-half ride," Elias said. 2 days by wagon if the roads are bad." "The hearing is in 3 days," she said. "Then it'd have to be fast," Elias said, stating it plainly, which was the only way he stated anything. Clara sat back in her chair and thought about it. 3 days. A day and a half to Billings, assuming the road held and the weather didn't turn. Half a day to find this man and persuade him to open his records to strangers. A day and a half back. That was 4 days minimum, which was one more than she had. I don't need Meridian for the hearing, she said slowly. What I have now is enough to challenge the forged claim on the property transfer. A good attorney could argue that in front of a judge and probably get the incompetency petition dismissed. She paused. But dismissed isn't the same as finished. Edgar would come back. He'd find another angle, file different papers, try again in 6 months with a cleaner forgery. She looked at the documents spread across the table. Meridian is how we end it, not just delay it. Nobody argued with her. Go to Billings, Wyatt said, finally. After the hearing. After the hearing, she agreed. The first night at Lone Ridge, Clara lay in the room at the end of the hall and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle around her. Old houses did that. They contracted in the cold and the wood shifted and spoke in sounds that were nothing like human language, but somehow communicated a particular kind of steadiness. Her father's house had done the same thing. She'd slept well in her father's house. She did not sleep well that night. It wasn't fear exactly. She'd moved past fear somewhere around the second hour of her ride to Lone Ridge that morning. Or rather, the fear had compressed into something smaller and denser, more like a stone in her chest than a weather system, easier to carry. What kept her awake was the specific, uncomfortable awareness that she had tied her legal survival to a man she did not know, in a place she had never slept before, with a hearing 3 days away and a conspiracy underneath her that was larger than she'd understood when she started pulling at the threads. She turned over. The mattress creaked. She thought about Wyatt Callahan saying yes before she'd finished her sentence. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a piece of quartz in your hand in the sun, looking for the angle that makes sense. He'd known Thomas Whitmore. He'd refused Edgar's offers. He'd kept Crow's fraudulent document in his lockbox for 18 months, which was not the action of a man who dismissed things that didn't concern him. It was the action of a man who kept evidence in case it became relevant. He'd been waiting, in his own way, for someone to connect the pieces. She wasn't sure whether that made her feel better or whether it was one more thing she'd have to figure out the meaning of later, when there was time. She decided it made her feel better and closed her eyes. She still didn't sleep for another 2 hours, but that was something she kept to herself. The morning routine at Lone Ridge began at 5 and made no accommodation for newcomers. Clara was awake before the sound of Elias in the yard reached her, which she considered a small personal victory. She dressed in the dark, pinned her hair without a mirror because she couldn't find one and wasn't going to open cabinet doors searching for it, and came out to find Mara already at the stove and Wyatt already gone to the barn. You ride? Mara asked without turning around. Yes. Can you drive a team? Clara hesitated half a second. I haven't in a while, but yes. Mara turned around and looked at her then. A full, even appraisal, the kind women gave each other when they were trying to take an accurate measure rather than a polite one. Clara met it without flinching. Good, Mara said, and turned back to the stove. By 6 o'clock, Clara was helping Elias run the fence line on the north pasture, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she'd come out of the barn with a horse she'd already saddled and asked what needed doing, and Elias had told her. The work was cold and physical and exactly what her body needed after too many days indoors with documents and dread. She didn't pretend to know more than she did about the fence repair. When she wasn't sure about the proper tension on a strand of wire, she said so and watched how Elias did it. He showed her without comment. She paid attention. Wyatt found them at the far corner of the north pasture around 8. He pulled up on his horse and looked at the repaired section of fence, then at Clara, then at Elias. Elias shrugged, which meant approximately, she asked, I told her, that's all there is to say about it. Wyatt said nothing. He turned his horse and rode back toward the barn. Clara looked at Elias. Did I do something wrong? Nope, Elias said, and clipped another wire. The attorney's name was Prescott Hale, and he had an office in Harlan Town above the hardware store that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. And something that might have been ambition, though it was hard to say whether that smell was coming from him or from the files that lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Clara had met him once before, briefly, when her father was still alive. Thomas Whitmore had trusted him, which was something. Not a great many people made it onto that list and stayed there. She and Wyatt rode in on the second morning, leaving Elias and Mara at the ranch. Clara had the full folder under her arm. Wyatt had Crow's document in his coat pocket. Hale looked at them across his desk with the particular expression of an attorney who has seen a great many things and calibrated his reactions accordingly. He looked at Clara. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at the way they were sitting, side by side but not close, the careful separate posture of two people who were still figuring out what the other one was. And he said nothing about any of that. "You filed the marriage certificate?" he asked. "Yesterday," Clara said, "at the clerk's office." "Good." He opened the folder she slid across to him and began reading. He read the way Wyatt had read, slowly, going back to check things. And the room was quiet enough that Clara could hear the pipe tobacco man 2 floors down arguing with someone about a bill. After 20 minutes, Hale set the folder down. "This forgery," he said, touching the document from the property index with one finger, "is genuinely poor work. Whoever did it was in a hurry, or they assumed no one with the skill to read it would bother looking." He picked up Crow's document. "This one is better, more careful, different hand." "Different person?" Clara asked. "Possibly, or the same person with more time." He set them both down. "Tell me about the holding company." Clara laid out what she knew about Meridian Land and Development. Hale listened with his hands folded on the desk. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "I've seen that name," he said. Clara sat forward. "Where?" "In connection with a deed dispute from 1874. Out of my hands by the time I saw it. It had already been settled, badly, in favor of the party I would not have favored." He opened a drawer and began looking through it with the controlled urgency of a man who knows exactly what he's looking for. There were 2 families who lost grazing rights in that dispute. The Hendersons and the Marsh family. Old widow named Ruth Marsh had been on that land for 15 years. He found a thin file and slid it out. The judgment was signed by a circuit judge named Finley, who has since retired to somewhere in Wyoming. He flipped the file open. The land agent in the transaction was listed as S. Crow, representing Meridian L&D. The room was very quiet. Wyatt leaned forward slightly. "That's 4 years ago." "Yes," Hale said. "Which means Edgar's been running this for at least 4 years, Clara said. "Longer, maybe. We just don't have documents that go back further yet." Hale looked at her steadily. "If I can establish a pattern of fraud across multiple victims, across multiple transactions, with a consistent agent and a holding company that appears to be a shell, this is no longer a matter of a family dispute over competency. This is a criminal matter. That changes the kind of pressure we can apply before the hearing." He paused. "It also increases the risk to you, because Edgar will see that too." "He'll already see it when the hearing doesn't go the way he planned," Clara said. "Yes, but there's a difference between a man who's lost a battle and a man who understands he's about to lose the war." Hale looked at her with the particular directness of someone who respects the person they're talking to enough not to soften it. "Edgar Voss will not walk away quietly. You should prepare for that." "I know," Clara said. Hale looked at Wyatt. "And you're in this willingly." "Yes," Wyatt said, in that particular way of his that was not elaboration and didn't pretend to be. Hale nodded slowly. "All right, let me work. Come back tomorrow morning." They rode back toward Lone Ridge in the mid-afternoon, the sun already dropping fast the way it did in early spring, when the warmth was still more promise than delivery. Clara's mind was going in 6 directions at once, and she led it, sorting through the pieces while her horse handled the road. Wyatt rode beside her without talking, which she was starting to understand was not indifference but preference. He was not a man who filled silence because silence made him uncomfortable. He was a man who was comfortable enough with his own thoughts that he didn't need to push them outward. She found herself oddly grateful for it. She'd spent the last 2 weeks surrounded by people who wanted to talk at her. Edgar's lawyer sending letters, the county clerk's assistant asking careful questions she understood were really Edgar's questions, her neighbor Mrs. Dunmore stopping by twice to express concern in the way that people express concern when they're actually delivering a message from someone else. The quiet was a relief. About 6 miles out from the ranch, Wyatt said, "My mother lost her property." Clara looked at him. Not to Edgar. This was before Edgar was running anything. Different man, different scheme, same principle. He was watching the road ahead. "My father had died." She was alone on the homestead. A land agent came around and told her there was a clerical error in the original filing, that the patent on the northwest quarter was technically invalid, that she could lose everything if she didn't settle quickly. He paused. She settled, gave up 30 acres for $200, which was a fraction of what it was worth, because she was frightened and alone, and there was no one to tell her she had any other choice. Clara was quiet. She moved in with my sister after that, Wyatt said. Spent the last 6 years of her life in a room in someone else's house. Another pause. It was a good house. My sister is a good woman, but it wasn't her own, and she knew it, and it changed something in her. I'm sorry, Clara said. I'm not telling you for sympathy. He glanced at her briefly. I'm telling you so you understand why I said yes before you finished your sentence. She thought about that for a long moment, about the shape of an old anger, kept clean and purposeful over years, and what it looked like when it finally had somewhere to go. Does it help? She asked. Doing this? Ask me after the hearing, he said. What? The night before the hearing, Clara couldn't eat. She sat at the kitchen table with her documents arranged in order for the 4th time, checking everything again, finding nothing new, but unable to stop. Mara sat across from her with a cup of tea and didn't try to make her feel better, which Clara appreciated more than she could have articulated. You've done everything you can do tonight, Mara said, around 9 o'clock. I know. But you're still going to sit there and read those papers again. Probably. Mara sighed and got up and refilled her own tea and Clara's and sat back down. They sat together in the kitchen with the lamp burning low between them and the sound of the wind picking up outside, and neither of them talked for a while. Elias was in a bad situation when we came to this ranch, Mara said eventually, not looking at Clara, looking at her tea. Not legal, personal. A bad history he was trying to get clear of. Wyatt gave him work without asking about it, and later, when it came up, because it always comes up, he said the same thing you're probably thinking about what you're doing. She turned the cup in her hands. That taking help isn't the same as being rescued, that recognizing what you need and going after it is just sense. Clara looked at her. You're telling me it's all right to let people help. I'm telling you that you came 12 miles in the dark with evidence in your hands, Mara said. And you asked for a specific thing for a specific reason, and you knew exactly why it would work. That's not someone being rescued. That's someone building a case. She stood up. Now go to sleep. You need to be sharp tomorrow. Clara sat for another 20 minutes after Mara went to bed. Then she stacked the documents, closed the folder, and went to her room. The Harlan County Courthouse was a 2-story limestone building with a leak in the roof above the east courtroom that had never been properly fixed, and on the morning of the hearing it dripped steadily into a tin bucket in the corner, the sound of it low and persistent beneath the business of the room. Edgar Voss was already there when Clara walked in. He was standing near the window with his attorney, a man named Collier from Bozeman, whose suits always fit perfectly and who had a reputation for making simple things sound inevitable. Edgar was in his dark coat, his gray hair combed flat, his watch chain visible at his vest pocket. He looked like authority. He'd always known how to look like authority. He saw Clara come in. His eyes went to Wyatt, who walked in just behind her, and something shifted in Edgar's face, a tightening, quickly controlled. He looked back at Collier and said something low. Collier looked at Clara and Wyatt, and then at the document Hale was carrying, and his expression did something more complicated. Prescott Hale set his files on the table and pulled out a chair for Clara without fuss. Wyatt sat beside her. Neither of them looked at Edgar again. Judge Carver came in at 9 sharp and sat down and looked at the room over his glasses with the patient expression of a man who had seen every variation of human dispute that property and family could generate and was not personally invested in any of them. We're here on the matter of the competency petition filed by Edgar Voss regarding one Clara Whitmore, he said. I have the petition. I understand there's a response. There is, Your Honor, Hale said and stood up. What followed was not dramatic in the way that Clara had half feared and half hoped it would be. Courts rarely were, in her experience. Hale presented the challenge to the forged property document methodically, walking the judge through the timeline discrepancy with the patience of a man who understood that clarity was more persuasive than emotion. He introduced Wyatt's document from Crow. He noted the name Meridian Land and Development and the connection to the 1874 dispute case on record. He said, calmly and without excess, that what appeared to be a family guardianship matter was in fact the surface layer of a larger pattern of fraudulent land transactions, and that filing a criminal complaint with the Territorial Land Office was under serious consideration pending further investigation. Collier objected twice. The judge sustained neither objection. Edgar sat very still. He had the particular stillness of a man who is recalculating quickly and doesn't want anyone to see him doing it. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye and thought about what Hale had said. The difference between a man who's lost a battle and a man who understands he's about to lose the war. She could see it happen in real time across Edgar's face, the small rearrangement of his expression, the moment his eyes stopped moving between Hale and the judge and went flat and inward. He wasn't thinking about today anymore. He was thinking about what came next. Judge Carver took 30 minutes to review the documents Hale submitted. Then he dismissed the competency petition. He noted for the record that the documentation supporting it was procedurally insufficient and contained a property claim of questionable origin that would require separate examination. He recommended that the county clerk flag the disputed transfer documents for review. It was not everything. It was nowhere near everything. But the petition was gone, and Clara's legal standing was intact, and Edgar had been seen, publicly, on the record, by a judge, using paperwork of questionable origin to make his case. Outside the courthouse, on the limestone steps, with the spring air coming through cold and clean, Clara stood for a moment and breathed. Wyatt was beside her, not close, just there. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "He's going to come back with something else." "Probably." She looked down at the street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning movement of Harlan, a wagon going past loaded with lumber, 2 women talking outside the dry goods store, a dog asleep in the sun by the post office. All of it proceeding as if nothing of any consequence had just happened in a courtroom above their heads. "Billings," she said. "After you've eaten something," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "You didn't eat a breakfast," he said, already moving down the steps. "There's a place on Meridian Street." He stopped at his own word and looked back at her. "That's an unfortunate street name given the circumstances." It surprised a short laugh out of her, sharp and unexpected, and she pressed her hand briefly to her mouth like she wasn't sure it was allowed. He was already at the bottom of the steps, hands in his coat pockets, looking up at her with an expression she was still learning the vocabulary of, not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. "Come on," he said. She came down the steps, and they walked together into the ordinary morning, and the drip of the courthouse leak continued behind them, and Edgar Voss watched from the window above as they turned the corner and disappeared from view. He watched for a long time after they were gone. Then he turned to Collier and said quietly, "Find Crow." Collier found Crow in 3 days. Clara didn't know that yet when she and Wyatt rode out of Harlan the morning after the hearing, heading northeast toward Billings with 2 days of provisions and the folder of documents redistributed between their saddlebags so that losing one horse wouldn't mean losing everything. She didn't know it when they made camp the first night in a draw out of the wind, or when they rode into Billings the following afternoon with the horses tired and her back aching from 2 days in the saddle and cold that hadn't decided to become spring yet, regardless of what the calendar said. What she knew was that the hearing had bought her time, not safety, and that Hale's warning about the difference between a man who'd lost a battle and a man who understood he was losing the war had been sitting in the back of her mind since the moment she'd watched Edgar turn from the courthouse window. The retired land office man's name was Cornelius Fitch, and he lived in a narrow house on the east side of Billings that looked as though it had been built by someone who didn't trust wide spaces. Every room was dense with shelving, and every shelf was dense with files, and Cornelius Fitch himself was a small, dry man of about 70, with the kind of careful eyes that had spent decades reading documents, and had gotten very good at identifying what didn't belong. He did not welcome them. He opened the door, looked at Clara and Wyatt standing on his porch, and said, "I don't do consultations." "My wife's cousin worked for you," Wyatt said. "Mara Boone. She spoke of you as a man who keeps accurate records." Fitch looked at Wyatt. He looked at Clara. He looked at the folder under her arm. "Mara Boone's a sensible woman," he said, and stepped back from the door. The front room was barely wide enough for the 3 of them to sit without their knees touching, but Fitch had a lamp angled precisely over his reading chair, and he used it now to go through Clara's documents with the particular attention of someone who is checking other people's work against a standard only he fully knows. He didn't speak while he read. He made small sounds occasionally. Not words, just the sounds a person makes when something confirms what they expected or contradicts it. After 40 minutes, he set the papers down on the arm of the chair. Meridian Land and Development, he said, filed as a private land investment trust in Dakota Territory in 1869, not Montana, Dakota. He looked at Clara over the top of his glasses, which is why you couldn't find it in the Montana Index. It was never registered here. It operated here, but it was never registered here. Is that legal? Clara asked. It's in a gray area that was considerably grayer in 1869 than it is now. The territorial boundaries and what crossed them were not well defined, and people like the ones behind Meridian understood that very well. He reached up to the shelf directly behind his left shoulder without looking, the action of long habit, and pulled down a file. I have the original registration documents. I made a copy when the trust was filed because the principal listed on the registration was someone I'd seen before in a different context, and I had a feeling it would become relevant eventually. He opened the file and held it out. Clara took it. She looked at the name on the registration. Edgar Arthur Voss, co-principal, alongside a name she didn't recognize, Warren D. Collier. She looked up sharply. Collier. The attorney from Bozeman? Wyatt asked, leaning to look. One and the same, Fitch said. Collier and Voss have been business partners since before Meridian was formed. Crow worked for them both, though you won't find his name on any official document. Crow was careful about that. What you will find, if you look at the agent records on the transactions I flagged in here, he pointed to a section of the file, is a consistent pattern of one party being represented by an agent whose description matches Crow, paid through a ledger account attached to Meridian. Clara's hands were very steady on the file. She'd learned to do that, to keep her hands steady when her mind was moving fast, because visibly shaking papers made people nervous, and she needed Fitch focused on helping her, not managing his concern about her. How many properties? She asked. In Montana Territory alone, 7 that I can document. There may be more I haven't connected yet. He folded his hands in his lap. The Marsh widow from 1874 you may already know about. There are 2 families in Yellowstone County, a timber claim in Cascade County, and 3 others scattered through the Musselshell Basin. 7 properties. 7 families or individuals who had been pushed off land or stripped of rights through the same machinery Edgar had been building since before Clara's father died. 7 that she knew about. She thought about her father's meticulousness, his careful documentation of everything, and she thought about the particular cruelty of using the habits of an honest man as a model for a dishonest scheme. And she felt something cold and clear move through her that wasn't anger exactly, but was the thing anger becomes when it runs out of heat and turns solid. We need certified copies, she said, of everything in this file that documents the Meridian registration and the pattern of transactions. Fitch nodded once. I'll have them ready by morning. What? They stayed at a boarding house 2 streets over. Wyatt took a room at one end of the hall, and Clara took one at the other, which was sensible and practical, and which Clara thought about for approximately 4 minutes before her mind returned to Meridian and the 7 properties, and the fact that Collier, Edgar's own attorney, the man who had stood in that courtroom 3 days ago defending the competency petition, was a co-founder of the shell company that had been generating fraudulent claims across the territory for nearly a decade. Collier had been in that courtroom. He had listened to Hale introduce the name Meridian Land and Development and connect it to the 1874 dispute. He had known, in that moment, exactly what was being uncovered, and he had said nothing, not because he was innocent, but because saying something would have confirmed it. And now Collier had gone back to Edgar, and they were both aware that what had been a manageable family dispute had become something considerably more dangerous to them. She knocked on Wyatt's door. He opened it after a moment, still dressed, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. Collier was there, she said. In the courtroom. He heard everything Hale said about Meridian. I know. He leaned against the doorframe. He went straight back to Edgar after. I know that too. She looked at him. We have 2 days before we ride back, assuming Fitch's copies are ready in the morning. That's 2 days where Edgar and Collier know what we know, and we don't know what they're doing about it. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. You want to move faster. I want to not be caught flat-footed, she said. There's a difference. He considered this. What are you thinking? Hale needs to know about Collier's name on the Meridian registration before Edgar and Collier have a chance to create a version of events that explains it away. If Hale can move to refer this to the Territorial Land Office before Edgar gets ahead of it, before Collier has time to work on whoever Hale would approach. She stopped. We need to send a letter tonight to Hale with what we know so he has it before we're back. There's a telegraph office, Wyatt said. She blinked. She'd been thinking letter, post rider, a day and a half in transit. A telegraph was same day. Does Hale have a telegraph address? He uses the one at the Harlan General Store. I've wired him before. He pushed off the door frame. Let me get my coat. The telegraph office on Billings Main Street was still open. Frontier telegraph offices kept late hours because ranchers and mining operations kept late hours. And the operator, a young woman with ink on her fingers, and the alert, slightly jaded expression of someone who had transmitted a great many urgent messages, took the wire Clara dictated without reaction. The message was precise. Collier co-registered Meridian with Voss, 1869, Dakota Territory. Fitch has certified documentation. 7 properties implicated Montana Territory. Move to refer Territorial Land Office before Collier can act. Copies arriving with us in 2 days. Whitmore Callahan. The operator counted the words and named a price, and Wyatt paid it, and they walked back to the boarding house through cold air that smelled of coal smoke and river water. You said Whitmore Callahan, Wyatt noted, not making it a question. It's the name on the marriage certificate, Clara said. It carries more weight than either name alone. I was quiet for a half block. That's practical, he said. Yes, she agreed. Neither of them said anything else about it. Fitch had the copies ready at 7 in the morning, organized with the meticulous precision of a man who had been making archival copies for 4 decades and had opinions about the proper way to do it. He handed them to Clara in a sealed envelope with a wax impression on the back that she understood was his own, a way of certifying, without a notary, that these were authentic reproductions of documents in his possession. If this goes to a territorial court, he said at the door, they may want my testimony. That's possible, Clara said. He looked at her steadily. I'll give it. He said it the way someone says something when they've been waiting a long time to have the opportunity and are not going to miss it now that it's arrived. I've been watching what Voss and Collier have been doing in this territory for years. I made copies for a reason. He paused. I was hoping someone would eventually come ask me about them. Clara looked at him, this small, dry, careful man in his narrow house full of files, who had been keeping evidence in the patient faith that it would matter to someone, someday. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, sharply, and closed the door. But the ride back to Harlan took 2 days again, and the weather held, which was the only thing that went straightforwardly. On the first night back in camp, Clara went through Fitch's copies by firelight while Wyatt kept watch, not because there was any specific threat, but because he was a man who defaulted to vigilance in open country, and she had learned in the past week not to argue with his instincts. She cross-referenced everything Fitch had given her against her own documents, building the full chain. The Meridian registration in 1869. The first fraudulent claim in the property records the following year. The Marsh dispute in 1874. Crow's activities in Yellowstone County, Cascade County, the Muscle Shell Basin. Crow's visit to Lone Ridge in the year before last. Edgar's competency petition against Clara. It was a 10-year operation, patient, methodical, picking off isolated landowners one at a time in different counties so that no single clerk or judge would see the whole shape of it. Designed to move slow enough not to draw attention and fast enough that by the time anyone connected the pieces, the transactions were finalized and the land was gone. Edgar had learned documentation from her father. He'd used it to build a machine for taking things from people who couldn't fight back. He picked people who were alone, she said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. Wyatt looked across the fire at her. The Marsh widow, the families in Yellowstone County. Me, after my father died. She set the papers down on her knee. He doesn't go after people with partners or community backing or anyone who can make noise. He finds people who are isolated. He waits until they're at their weakest, estate, death, financial difficulty. And then he moves. She paused. That's why your refusal bothered him so much. You weren't isolated. You had workers who would talk. Reputation in the county. He couldn't get the same leverage on you that he could on the others. So he left me alone and filed my boundary document away for later, Wyatt said, in case he needed it. She looked at the fire. He was going to come back for your property eventually, after mine, after enough time had passed. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. How many people do you think he did this to that we don't have records of? It was a question she'd been not asking herself for 2 days because the answer was too large and too heavy to carry alongside everything else she needed to carry right now. More than 7, she said. The fire shifted. An ember cracked and dropped. Wyatt picked up a branch and laid it on without being asked. When this is done, he said, not looking at her, when the land office investigation is open and the criminal referral is filed, someone should write to the families, the ones we can find records for. Let them know what happened. Let them know it wasn't a legitimate transaction. She looked at him. He was still watching the fire. It won't give them back the land, he said. But knowing the truth is different from not knowing it. She thought about her mother, who had never been told clearly enough that she was right, that what had been done to her was wrong, that she hadn't imagined it or been foolish to trust. She died with the uncertainty in her, a low, persistent doubt that Clara had spent years trying to talk her out of. Yes, Clara said. We'll write to them. They reached Harlan on the 3rd afternoon and went directly to Hale's office. Hale was expecting them. He was standing when they came in, which meant he'd heard them on the stairs, and he had papers already spread on his desk in a way that suggested he'd been preparing for this conversation since the telegraph arrived. Sit down, he said. They sat. The Territorial Land Office. He put his hand on a letter on the corner of the desk. I contacted them 2 days ago with what you wired. I have a response. They're interested. He said interested the way attorneys say things when they mean considerably more than the word itself. There is an investigator who has been looking at irregular land transactions in Dakota Territory for the past 18 months, who has noted Meridian's name in connection with 2 separate complaints there. He was not aware the same entity was operating in Montana. Clara felt the particular sensation of 2 separate investigations becoming one larger thing, like 2 river channels meeting. A sudden increase in pressure and momentum. He's coming here? She asked. He'll be in Harlan within the week. Hale paused. There's something else. Since the telegraph, I've made some inquiries about Collier. His law license is registered in Montana Territory and also Dakota Territory, which is unusual for a practicing attorney of his stated focus. He looked at her carefully. He is also listed as an officer of record for a charitable foundation that receives several land transfers in Yellowstone County, the same transfers that appear in Fitch's documentation. The room was very quiet. He's not just Edgar's lawyer, Clara said. He appears to be considerably more than that, Hale agreed. My understanding is that Edgar brought in Collier early, possibly at the beginning of the scheme. Collier provided the legal structure. Edgar provided the local knowledge and the family relationships that allowed him to identify vulnerable targets. Crow was the operational agent, the one who showed up at doors with documents. He set his hands flat on the desk. What you have built, between Fitch's files and your own documentation, is the skeleton of the case. What the territorial investigator will do is put flesh on it. How long? Wyatt asked. The investigation? Months, possibly longer. Hale looked at him. This is not going to resolve in a week. What is already resolved is the immediate threat to Clara's property and legal standing, the larger matter, the criminal referral, the investigation, the question of what happens to the other 7 families. That takes time. Clara absorbed this. She'd known it on some level. You didn't dismantle a 10-year scheme in a week. You just started pulling threads, and then you kept pulling. What does Edgar do while we wait? She asked. Hale's expression shifted slightly. That's what I want to talk to you about. He picked up a second letter from beneath the first and held it out to her. She took it. It was addressed to Prescott Hale in Collier's handwriting. She recognized it from the documents, the same cramped, careful script that tried to take up as little space as possible. The letter proposed, on behalf of Edgar Voss, a settlement. Edgar would withdraw all claims related to Clara's property and competency in exchange for Clara dropping any complaint to the Territorial Land Office and agreeing to a deed of sale of the Clearwater Creek timber rights at a fair market valuation to be determined by a mutually agreed assessor. He was still trying to buy the timber. Even now, with the investigation opening, With Collier's name on the Meridian registration about to become known to territorial authorities, Edgar's first instinct was to get the timber rights out of Clara's hands through a transaction that looked legitimate. "He doesn't know what Fitch gave us," Wyatt said, reading over her shoulder. "He knows we went to Billings," Clara said. "He doesn't know we found Fitch. He thinks we went looking for the Meridian registration and didn't find it because it wasn't in the Montana Index, and he's trying to move quickly before the investigation gets organized." She set the letter down. "He thinks he still has time to make this go away cleanly." "Do you want to respond?" Hale asked. She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "No," she said. "If I engage with a settlement offer, it signals that I'm still in a negotiating position. I'm not negotiating. I'm cooperating with a territorial investigation." She looked at Hale. "Can you send a response to Collier on my behalf that declines the settlement and notes, formally, that I am cooperating fully with the Territorial Land Office inquiry?" Hale allowed himself a small, precise expression of satisfaction. "I'll have it sent this afternoon." Silas Crow appeared at Lone Ridge 6 days later. Clara was in the office going through the ranch accounts. She'd started on them at Wyatt's request, partly because she was good with numbers and he wasn't, and partly because having something concrete to do with her hands kept the waiting from becoming unbearable. When Elias knocked on the doorframe and said, with his characteristic economy of language, "Man at the gate, says he's here about a property matter," Clara looked up. "What does he look like?" "Medium height, brown coat, rides a gray horse." A pause. "Keeps his hands where you can see them, which means he knows it makes people nervous when he doesn't." Clara set down her pen. "That's Crow." She heard Wyatt's boots in the hallway before she finished saying it. She stood up and straightened her jacket and went to the door. Wyatt was already in the hall, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he'd already calculated several things and decided to let this play out before making any of them. "Let him in," Clara said. Elias went back to the gate. Clara and Wyatt stood on the porch and watched Silas Crow ride up the track. He was younger than she'd imagined. She'd been building a picture of him from his actions, and she'd imagined someone older, more weathered, someone who looked like the kind of man who did the things he did. Instead, he was perhaps 40, with a forgettable face and careful, measuring eyes that moved across the ranch yard with the practiced assessment of someone who has spent a lot of time arriving at properties and reading them for weaknesses. He stopped his horse at the porch steps and looked at Clara. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. Getting the name right, not Whitmore. A small signal that he'd done his preparation. "Mr. Crow," she said. He looked at Wyatt. "Mr. Callahan." "You've got a name for everyone," Wyatt said. Crow almost smiled. "That's my job." He reached into his coat, slowly, and with the deliberate care of someone who does not want to be shot on a stranger's porch, and withdrew a sealed envelope. "I've been asked to deliver this personally and wait for a response." He held it out. Clara came down the 2 porch steps and took it without breaking eye contact with him. She opened it where she stood. It was a different kind of document than she expected. Not a legal claim, not a settlement offer like the one Collier had sent Hale. It was a letter in Edgar's handwriting, not Collier's, which meant Edgar had decided to write it himself, which meant something had changed. She read it twice. The letter said that Edgar was aware a territorial investigator was coming to Harlan. It said he understood that certain documents had been obtained in Billings that were being misrepresented as evidence of wrongdoing. It said that he had, in his possession, a letter written by Thomas Whitmore, Clara's father, in which Thomas had expressed his intention to transfer the Clearwater Creek timber rights to Edgar upon his death, and that Edgar had refrained from presenting this document earlier out of family sensitivity, but was now compelled to do so in his own defense. Clara's hands did not shake. She read the letter a 3rd time. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "A letter," she said, to no one in particular. Her voice was very even. "Ma'am?" Crow said. She looked at him. "Tell Mr. Voss I've received his letter." Crow waited, clearly expecting more. "That's all," she said. "Tell him I received it." Crow held her gaze for a moment, reading her, the way she imagined he read every person he was sent to, looking for the crack, the give, the place where pressure would find purchase. He found nothing, or decided he found nothing, and nodded once and turned his horse. She watched him ride back down the track and out the gate. Wyatt had come down off the porch to stand beside her. "What does it say?" She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face while he did. When he looked up, his expression was the particular flatness of someone who is angry and managing it with extreme precision. "Your father didn't write that letter," he said. It was not a question. "My father never intended to give that land to Edgar," Clara said. "I knew every plan my father had for that property. He talked to me about it every year, every season. He had plans drawn up for the timber operation. He hired a surveyor the spring before he got sick." She looked at the gate where Crow had disappeared. He would never have given it to Edgar. Edgar knew that. Edgar knows I know that. "So it's another forgery?" "Yes." She paused. "But this one is different. A forged property transfer in the county index is one thing. It's a document in a bureaucratic record, and its problems are technical. A forged personal letter in my father's handwriting is something I will have to stand in front of a judge and testify against." She felt the full weight of what Edgar had just done arrive in her chest. "He's not trying to beat me in the land office investigation. He's trying to put me in a position where my word is the only thing I have." Because that was what Edgar had always understood about her, she realized. He'd understood it from the beginning. She was isolated. She was a woman. In any contest where documentation was on his side and her credibility was on hers, the advantage would go to the documentation. He'd been building toward this. The investigation had accelerated his timeline, but this move, the letter in her father's handwriting, had been in reserve, a personal forgery. Harder to disprove than a date discrepancy in a county record, designed to make her look like a grieving daughter who couldn't accept her father's choices. She breathed once, slowly. "I need to see the letter," she said. "The original, whatever Edgar claims to have." "He's not going to show it to you. He'll show it to the court." She turned and went back up the porch steps. "And when he does, I need to be ready." Inside, she went back to the desk and sat down. She did not pick up the pen again. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and thought about her father. His handwriting, his way of phrasing things, the particular vocabulary he used in formal correspondence versus personal letters, the specific ink he favored, the way he always dated his personal letters with the full month written out rather than abbreviated. She knew her father's correspondence better than anyone alive. That was either going to be enough or it wasn't. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write down every specific detail she could remember, every identifying characteristic of her father's authentic letters, everything that a skilled forger operating from a limited sample of his handwriting would likely get wrong. She wrote for an hour without stopping. When she was done, she had 3 pages in her own hand and a clearer sense of what the fight ahead looked like. Wyatt appeared in the doorway at some point during that hour, saw what she was doing, and went away without speaking. He came back after she'd finished with coffee and what was left of the morning's cornbread, which he set on the edge of the desk without comment. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and leaned in the doorway, drinking his own coffee and looking at nothing in particular while she ate. Just present, just there. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. She knew that. She was capable of doing this without anyone standing in her doorway drinking coffee. She'd been capable of doing hard things alone for years. But there was something about not having to be alone with it. Not because someone had taken the problem from her, but because someone was simply there, choosing to be in the same room while she worked through it. That changed the quality of the difficulty in a way she couldn't quite name. She finished the cornbread. She picked up her pen. Outside, the wind had come up from the north, and it hit the side of the house with a low, steady pressure that made the lamp flame angle slightly without going out. She kept writing. The territorial investigator's name was Martin Gear, and he arrived in Harlan on a Thursday with a leather satchel that looked like it had been dropped from a horse at least twice, in a manner that gave nothing away about what he thought of anything he was looking at. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something harder and more precise than it had started as. And he asked questions the way a good carpenter measured wood, twice, from 2 different angles, before he committed to a cut. Hale had arranged the meeting at his office, and Clara and Wyatt arrived to find Gear already there, already reading, already 3/4 through the stack of documents Hale had sent ahead. He looked up when they came in. He looked at Clara first, then at Wyatt, then back at his documents. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "your letter to the land office was the most organized complaint I've received in 11 years of doing this work. Most people who come to us with fraud cases bring a box of unsorted papers and a great deal of emotion. You brought a logical sequence with cross-references." He said it not as a compliment, but as an observation. Sit down. They sat. I've reviewed what you have from Fitch, Gear continued, setting the papers down with the careful alignment of someone who had spent too many years in archives to leave anything crooked. I've also reviewed what my office has from Dakota Territory. The overlap is significant. Meridian Land and Development was the vehicle, Crow was the instrument, and Voss and Collier were the architects. He looked at Clara. You know about the letter. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. The letter Edgar claims my father wrote, yes. He's already submitted it to the county clerk as evidence in a pending civil filing. Gear watched her face when he said this. He moved faster than I expected. Clara felt the cold drop of it settle in her stomach, but she kept her expression level. He knew you were coming, and he needed to establish the letter before you arrived, so it would be in the record as a prior document rather than a reactive one. Yes. Gear looked at her with the particular attention of someone recalibrating a first assessment upward. That's exactly right. He needed it dated before my involvement, so it couldn't be characterized as a document manufactured in response to an investigation. He leaned back, which means whoever advised him on this, Collier, presumably, is sophisticated about how investigations develop. They're building a defense in parallel with what you're building against them. What does the letter say? Wyatt asked. That Thomas Whitmore expressed his intention, in writing, to transfer the Clearwater Creek timber rights to Edgar Voss upon his death, in gratitude for Edgar's years of support and management assistance after Thomas's wife died. The letter is dated 14 months before Thomas Whitmore's death. Gear paused. It is written in what appears to be Thomas Whitmore's handwriting and uses his customary signature. The room was quiet enough that Clara could hear the distant sound of someone hammering something on the street below. My father never wrote that letter, she said. I can tell you exactly why, and I have 3 pages of specific identifying characteristics of his authentic correspondence that will demonstrate the differences when you have the original in hand. She reached into her folder and put the pages she'd written on the desk in front of Gear. He abbreviated months in personal letters, always. He never wrote out the full month in correspondence to family. The date format Edgar would need to use to make this look authentic would require him to write September rather than Septine, and my father never did that. He also used a particular phrase when referring to the timber rights. He called it the Clearwater Stand, not the Clearwater Creek timber rights. It was his own shorthand. He used it in every document and letter I have from him going back 15 years. Gear picked up the 3 pages and read them. He read slowly, as he did everything. You wrote this from memory? He asked, without looking up. Yes. In one sitting? Yes. He set the pages down. If even half of these discrepancies are present in the forged letter, it won't survive scrutiny from a qualified document examiner. He looked at her steadily. The problem is time. Getting a qualified examiner here, having him review the original, which Edgar will resist producing, and entering that examination into the record before the civil filing can advance will take weeks, possibly longer. Edgar knows that, Wyatt said. Edgar is counting on it, Gear said. The civil filing creates a competing claim that muddies the criminal investigation. While my office is pursuing fraud across 7 properties in 2 territories, Edgar's attorney is in civil court arguing that the original property transfer was a matter of the deceased's expressed wishes, which is a family matter, not a criminal one, and which therefore should be resolved before any criminal finding can be applied. He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down without drinking. It's a standard delay tactic, and it's effective because it works on the timeline. The longer this takes, the more fatigued everyone becomes. Witnesses become unavailable. Memories become uncertain. Clerks who flag documents get transferred or retire. Clara looked at the desk surface for a moment. She was thinking about something, and it was almost there. The other families, she said. Gear looked at her. The 7 properties in Montana. The 2 complaints in Dakota. She looked up. Have any of them been contacted about this investigation? Not formally, no. We have the records, but notification of affected parties is typically done later in the process, once the investigation has... If they come forward, Clara said, it's not just your records and Fitch's copies and my documents against Edgar's forged letter. It's 9 or more individuals who can testify to the same pattern of approach, the same methods, the same agent, the same holding company. She leaned forward. Edgar can argue that one letter from a dead man represents a private family intention. He cannot argue that 9 separate property owners all had the same private family intention with Edgar Voss. The room was very quiet. Hale, who had been sitting in the corner with his hands folded and had said almost nothing since they arrived, said, "She's right." Gear looked at Hale. He looked at Clara. He tapped one finger on the desk twice. "It would accelerate the timeline considerably," he said. "If affected parties submit formal statements to my office, if even 4 or 5 of the 7 Montana cases produce witnesses willing to testify, it changes the weight of the civil filing. A judge looking at one disputed family letter will weigh it differently when it's entered into a record that already contains half a dozen similar cases with the same principles." He paused. "Who would contact them?" "We would," Clara said. She glanced at Wyatt. "We said we'd write to them. We'll write to them now, with a specific ask." Gear studied her for a moment. "You understand that some of them may not respond, that some may be too frightened, or too far from the relevant courts, or simply too worn out from what happened to them to engage again." "I understand that," she said, "but some of them will." They spent the rest of that day in Hale's office, cross-referencing Gear's Dakota files against Fitch's Montana documentation to build a contact list. 7 Montana addresses, 2 Dakota ones. Not all of them had clear forwarding information. The Marsh widow had died 2 years after losing her land, which Clara noted in the margin of her list with the particular grimness of an accounting rather than a feeling, because the feeling was too large to carry right now, and the accounting was something she could do. Wyatt wrote the letters. This surprised her. She had assumed she would write them, and she'd been composing the language in her head while she worked through the contact list. And when she said she was going to start drafting, Wyatt said, "Let me." She looked at him. "You'll write it like a legal document," he said. Not unkindly. "These are people who lost their land. They don't need another piece of formal correspondence. They need to know that someone who understands what happened to them is asking them to stand up one more time." She was quiet for a moment. "And you think you're better suited to that than I am?" "I think I've watched what it does to a person to lose their property to someone like Crow," he said. "And I know what kind of letter my mother would have responded to." She handed him the pen. She sat beside him while he wrote and occasionally supplied specific details from Gear's files, names, dates, property descriptions, and did not look over his shoulder, though she wanted to. When he was done with the first letter and slid it across to her, she read it without speaking. It was not formal. It was not elegant in the way she would have made it elegant. It was direct and plain, and it said, in essence, "We know what was done to you. We know you weren't wrong to fight it, and we are asking you to be part of ending it." It said the investigation was real, and that a territorial officer was involved, and that their testimony would matter. It said they didn't have to come to Harlan. They only had to write. It said near the end, in a sentence that made her stop and read it twice, "You lost something that was yours, and nothing will give that back. But the man who took it is still taking from others, and you have the power to stop him, and I believe you're the kind of person who would want to know that." She set the letter down. "This is good," she said. He took it back and continued to the next one. She went back to the contact list. They sent 9 letters by post-rider that evening, with a 10th to Cornelius Fitch asking him to prepare a formal sworn statement for Gear's office. The waiting that followed was not the passive kind. Clara had never been good at passive waiting, and the 2 weeks after the letters went out had more activity in them than she'd had in any 2-week period she could recently remember, which was saying something. She and Mara reorganized the ranch accounts and identified 3 places where costs could be cut and 2 where a small investment would yield significant return by fall. She rode the property lines twice with Elias and learned the geography of Lone Ridge in the particular intimate way you only learn land by walking or riding it repeatedly, where the ground went soft after rain, where the northern fence line had a chronic problem with post-heave from the freeze-thaw, where the best grass came up earliest in spring. She also started reviewing the Clearwater Creek property records in a different frame, not for evidence of Edgar's fraud, which she had, but for a clear picture of what her father had actually built there and what it was worth now. If the investigation concluded successfully, if the criminal referral led to charges, if the civil filing was defeated, she would have land again. She would have timber rights and acreage and the beginning of a business. She needed to know what she was going to do with it. Wyatt found her at the kitchen table one evening with topographical survey maps spread across most of the surface, making notes in the margin. "The eastern section here," she said without looking up, because she'd heard him come in and knew the particular sound of his boots by now. "The stands of timber my father marked for selective harvest. These aren't just lumber. The species composition is unusual for this elevation. Douglas fir mixed with western larch on the north-facing slopes. If I had a buyer for finished lumber rather than raw logs, the margin would be substantially better than what my father was negotiating." Wyatt sat down across from her and looked at the maps. "There's a mill in Billings." "I know. I looked into it when we were there." She made another note. "The owner is named Harker. He's been sourcing from further south because the operations closer to him have been inconsistent with quality. If I can demonstrate a reliable supply, consistent grade, consistent delivery schedule, he'd consider a contract." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. "You're planning past the investigation," he said. "I've been planning past the investigation since I rode to your gate," she said, which was true. The investigation was the immediate problem. The land was the actual future. She'd always known the difference. She looked up at him then and found him looking at her with an expression she was becoming more familiar with. The particular expression of a man who is discovering something he hadn't anticipated and isn't entirely sure what to do about it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked back at the maps. "You do that when you don't want to say something," she said. "Do what?" "Say nothing in that particular way." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that you came to my door with a plan to survive and you're sitting at my table planning to build something. That's a change." "It's not a change," she said. "This is what I came to your door to protect. The ability to build something. The survival was just the first part." He looked at the maps again, at her notes in the margins, at the way she'd marked the eastern timber stands with small, careful symbols that she alone understood. "Would you want to expand the cedar operation on the northern boundary?" he asked. "Lone Ridge cedar. I've been thinking about it for 2 years, but I haven't had the—" He stopped. "Capital," she finished. "Or the time." "Both." She looked at the northern boundary on her mental map of Lone Ridge, which by now was nearly as detailed as her map of the Clearwater property. Young cedar on north-facing ground, good soil retention, a natural water access that made irrigation unnecessary. It would take 5 years before the first meaningful harvest. It was exactly the kind of long-view investment that the ranch needed, and that a man managing the daily demands of the operation alone would never have time to plan. "Combined operation," she said slowly. "Cedar from Lone Ridge and fir larch mix from Clearwater. 2 different products, 2 different markets, but the same transport relationship with the Billings mill." She looked at him. "That's actually better than either alone." He was very still in the way she'd come to recognize as him thinking hard rather than having nothing to say. "Yes," he said. "It is." They sat with the maps between them for another hour, not always talking, passing a pencil back and forth, and neither of them mentioned that they had started by talking about her land and ended up talking about both their lands as though they were already the same operation, because some things were better not said directly until the moment was right, and neither of them was quite ready to find out when that moment was. The first response came 8 days after they sent the letters. It was from a man named Horatio Webb in Yellowstone County, one of the 2 families Fitch had identified in his files. Webb had lost grazing rights on 60 acres in 1875 through a boundary dispute that Crow had initiated with a document claiming an earlier survey had placed the property line 200 yards to the east of where Webb believed it to be. Webb had been too old and too poor to fight it and had accepted a buyout at below market value. The letter Webb sent to Clara was 3 pages long, handwritten in a shaking script that she read with her hand pressed flat on the table to keep it from doing something she would have to manage. Webb said he'd known something was wrong. He'd said so to anyone who would listen for 2 years after, and nobody had. He'd begun to believe that his memory was faulty, that he'd been confused, that perhaps at his age he'd misread the original survey. He said he would write whatever she needed him to write, and he would come to Harlan if it meant anything, and he would tell anyone who asked him exactly what Silas Crow had said when he showed up at his gate with a document and a deadline. 2 days after Webb's letter, a response came from the Yellowstone County family, a woman named Frances Alderman, who had inherited her husband's homestead claim after he died and had been separated from the southern 30 acres of it in 1876 through a transaction she had never fully understood. Frances was 58 years old, and she wrote in the brisk, slightly combative style of someone who had spent 2 years being angry with nowhere to put it. She said she had kept every document from the transaction, including the original deed, and that she had always suspected the boundary description in Crow's filing had been altered because she remembered what the original survey said. She said she had the original survey. Clara read that sentence twice and then called for Wyatt. He read the letter. He read that sentence. She kept the original survey, he said. Locked away somewhere on her property for 2 years, Clara said, waiting for someone to ask. By the end of the 3rd week, 5 of the 9 people they'd written to had responded. 5 letters. 5 separate accounts of Crow arriving at their property with documentation and a deadline. 5 individual descriptions of the same pattern: a land agent, a holding company, a legal document with a discrepancy they couldn't immediately identify, pressure applied at a moment of personal vulnerability. Gear received each one and added it to the file his office was building, and Clara could see the weight of the case shifting the way weight shifts when you add enough mass to one side of a scale, gradually at first, then with a decisiveness that is hard to reverse. She was at Hale's office when Gear came in with a new piece of documentation on a Tuesday afternoon and set it on the desk without preamble. The document examiner finished his preliminary assessment of Edgar's letter, Gear said. Clara looked up from the affidavit she was reviewing. He found 8 of the 12 discrepancies you identified, Gear said, including both the month abbreviation and the property name shorthand. The room went completely still. 8, Hale said. 8. Gear sat down. The examiner's opinion is that the letter is not consistent with Thomas Whitmore's authenticated correspondence. He will not say definitively that it's a forgery in his preliminary report because he's cautious about definitives until he's done the full analysis, but 8 discrepancies is not in the range of normal variation. He looked at Clara. Your 3 pages from memory were more accurate than the forgery. She thought about her father at his desk, writing letters in the lamplight, the particular unhurried quality of the way he moved a pen, the way he always looked at what he'd written before he folded it. She thought about knowing someone deeply enough that you carry their habits inside you like a second skeleton. He taught me to read carefully, she said. He said the most important thing in any document was what wasn't there. The omissions told you more than the content. Gear nodded slowly. The civil filing is going to collapse, he said. It may take another 2 or 3 weeks for the examiner's full report, but once it's in the record, Collier will see that the letter is a liability rather than an asset. At that point, they'll either withdraw it, which is an admission, or proceed with it and watch it be dismantled in court. Which option does Collier choose? Wyatt asked. In my experience, Gear said, attorneys like Collier withdraw when they can do it quietly and proceed when they think they can still win. Given what's in the record right now, 5 witness statements, Fitch's documentation, the examiner's preliminary findings, I don't think Collier believes he can still win. He paused. Which means Edgar is about to find out that his attorney is going to protect his own license before he protects his client. Edgar came to the ranch on a Friday. No advance notice, no letter, no intermediary. He simply came. Clara was in the yard when he arrived. She had been helping Elias replace the problematic fence posts on the north line and had come back to wash at the pump, and she heard the hoofbeats and looked up and saw Edgar Voss coming through the gate alone, without Collier, without Crow, on his own horse. She dried her hands on the cloth she was carrying and stood where she was. He was 61 years old, and he looked it, which she noticed now in a way she hadn't before. Not because anything had changed in how he looked, but because she was looking at him differently. She had spent months examining the architecture of what he'd built, the patience of it, the methodology, the cold arithmetic of finding people at their worst moments and taking from them, and seeing the man himself in the ordinary daylight of a Friday afternoon was a smaller thing than she'd expected. He stopped his horse 20 feet away and looked at her. She did not go to him. After a moment, he dismounted and walked toward her, holding the reins. He stopped at 10 feet. Clara, he said. Edgar. He looked older than he had at the courthouse. Something had gone out of him since then. The particular quality of a man who believes he controls what's coming. He didn't look frightened, exactly. He looked reduced. I'd like to talk, he said. Talk, she said. He glanced around the yard. Elias was visible at the corner of the barn, doing nothing in particular with a piece of tack, but clearly present. Mara was at the kitchen window. Wyatt wasn't visible, which either meant he hadn't come out or he was somewhere she couldn't see. Privately, Edgar said. No, Clara said. A small muscle moved at the corner of Edgar's jaw. He absorbed the refusal. Collier is withdrawing the civil filing, he said. I know. The investigation? He stopped. Started again. There are things in that investigation that involve other people besides me. I want you to know that. I know that too. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't guilt. It was something older and more complicated than either of those words. The expression of a man confronting a version of events that doesn't match the one he's been telling himself. Your father and I, he started. Don't, she said. Her voice came out quiet but very clear, the way her voice did when she was absolutely certain of something. Don't talk to me about my father. He wasn't easy to... Don't. She took one step toward him, and she watched him hold his ground but shift his weight slightly back, which was its own kind of answer. I know what you're going to say. You're going to tell me that Thomas was difficult, that he didn't appreciate you, that you spent years helping him and he left you nothing, and that's why you did what you did. She looked at him steadily. I've been through every piece of his correspondence. I know exactly how my father treated you, and I know that what you built with Collier and Crow started before Thomas was even sick. It started when you saw what the timber was worth and decided that family was a door, not a relationship. Edgar said nothing. You used us, she said. You used my mother's death, and my father's illness, and my inheritance, and 7 other families who had nothing to do with us. You built a machine out of other people's worst moments. She paused. The investigation is going to say all of this in language that will go into a territorial court record, and there will be nothing I have to do to make that happen. It's already happening. He was very still. I came to ask you, he started. No, she said. Whatever you came to ask, no. He looked at her for a long moment. She saw him consider several things and discard them one by one, like a man emptying his pockets looking for something he doesn't find. Then he said very quietly, You're more like Thomas than I realized. She didn't know if he meant it as a compliment or a concession or just an observation from a man with nothing left to bargain with. She decided it didn't matter. Go home, Edgar, she said. He looked at her one more time. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and mounted and rode out the gate without looking back. She stood in the yard and watched him go. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle off the hills, the way it did in late spring when the days were finally getting longer, and the yard was warm in a way that it hadn't been when she first arrived here. Behind her she could hear Mara moving in the kitchen, and the rhythm of Elias returning to something that needed doing, and then the sound of boots on the porch steps. Wyatt came and stood beside her. He had been there then, somewhere she couldn't see, present as he tended to be. He came alone, she said. Yes. Collier didn't come with him. Crow didn't come with him. She watched the gate where Edgar had disappeared. That's what the end looks like, I think, when someone comes alone. Wyatt didn't say anything for a moment. Are you all right? He asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd made herself think about things honestly since she was 19 and had learned that the cost of not doing so was too high. I'm angry, she said. I've been angry for a long time, and I think I'm going to be angry for a while yet, and that's different from not being all right. She looked at him. I'm all right. He nodded. The yard was quiet around them. The horses in the corral moved along the fence. A hawk turned in a wide circle over the north pasture and dropped and was gone. The cedar, Wyatt said after a while. She looked at him. The northern boundary, he said. I was thinking we could start clearing the underbrush on the lower section next week. Get the ground ready for planting in the fall. She understood what he was doing. He was pointing at the next thing, not away from what had just happened, but past it, toward what came after it. She had not realized until this moment how much she'd needed someone to do exactly that. Next week, she said. The hawk came back up out of the draw and turned in its circle again, and the light moved on the hills, and the afternoon went on in the ordinary beautiful way of afternoons that have no idea they've been waited for. The underbrush clearing on the northern boundary started on a Monday, the way most hard work starts. Without ceremony, without particular optimism, just people showing up with tools and beginning. Wyatt had marked the lower section the previous week with stakes and twine, laying out the grid of what would eventually become the cedar planting. The ground there was good. Clara had been right about that when she'd looked at it on the map, and being right about it in person, standing on the actual soil and feeling the way it held under her boots, was a different and more satisfying kind of being right. It was darker than the ranch yard soil, with more organic matter, and it held moisture from the snowmelt in a way that meant natural establishment would be easier than it would be on the exposed southern slopes. Elias worked without talking, which was his way. Mara had come out for the first hour and then gone back to other things, pausing on her way past Clara to hand her a pair of heavier gloves without being asked. Wyatt worked with the efficiency of a man who had been doing physical labor since he was 12 and no longer thought about it consciously. His body just knew where to put the weight, how to angle the cut, where to stop and assess before continuing. Clara worked alongside him and did not pretend to be as efficient, because she wasn't. She'd done her share of physical work over the years. There was no running a property alone without it. But her particular skills were in other directions, and she knew the difference between working hard and working well. She asked when she wasn't sure. She paid attention to the answers. By noon, they'd cleared a third of the section. They ate lunch at the edge of the cleared ground, sitting on a fallen log with the cold still coming up from the earth, despite the spring sun overhead. Wyatt had brought water and cornbread. Clara had brought the notes she'd been working on for the Harker Mill meeting, which she pulled out briefly and then put back because this wasn't the moment. "When do you go to Billings?" Wyatt asked. 2 weeks, if Gear's timeline holds. She broke off a piece of cornbread. "I want to have the examiner's full report in hand before I meet with Harker. If the civil filing is formally withdrawn before that meeting, it makes the Clearwater operation look more stable to a potential contract partner." Wyatt nodded. He was looking at the cleared ground, at the raw, turned earth and the piled brush at the edge of it, the beginning of something that wasn't yet visible. "The east section of Clearwater," he said, "the steep ground by the creek. Your father surveyed it for timber but never harvested it." "He was waiting for prices to improve," Clara said. "They were going to, that year, but then he got sick and nothing happened with it. That ground, harvested right, selective cut, not clear cut, would come back in 10 years with good second growth if it's managed correctly." He looked at her. "My father did the same thing on the eastern 40 here before he lost it. Left the steep creek ground alone, and it's some of the best standing timber on the property now, 30 years later." She looked at him. They had talked about the land a great deal in the past weeks, but he rarely brought up his father's property unprompted. He talked about his mother occasionally, usually obliquely, in the way he had of making points by way of example, but the father was someone he kept mostly interior. "He was a good manager?" she asked carefully. "He was good at the land," Wyatt said, "not as good at the people side of things. He trusted too quickly or not at all, nothing in between." A pause. "After he died, when the land agent came for my mother, she didn't know how to fight it because he'd never shown her that part. He'd kept her separate from it." "He thought he was protecting her," Clara said. "Probably." He looked at his hands. She didn't see it that way afterward. She said she felt like she'd been kept from her own life. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about that a lot after. What it means to protect someone by keeping them ignorant of what they need to know." Clara was quiet too. She thought about her father, who had done the opposite, who had included her in every conversation, every decision, every document, until the land and the business and the legal structure of the property were as known to her as her own name, who had taught her to read carefully and keep copies and never sign anything she didn't understand completely, who had, she realized now, been preparing her for exactly this. Not because he'd foreseen Edgar's scheme, but because he'd understood that the world treated isolated women the way it treated isolated anything, as easier targets. He'd given her the knowledge not to be ignorant of what she needed to know. "Your father taught you to fight," Wyatt said, not quite a question. "He taught me to know things," she said. "The fighting came naturally." "Oh." Gear's full report arrived at Hale's office 17 days after Edgar rode out of the Lone Ridge Gate, and it was everything and also more than that. The document examiner's conclusion on the forged letter was unambiguous in the final report, in a way the preliminary had carefully not been. The letter attributed to Thomas Whitmore was not consistent with his authenticated correspondence, and bore multiple indicators of fabrication, including, but not limited to, inconsistent date format, non-standard property terminology, and ink composition inconsistent with the period indicated by the date. The examiner had also, on further analysis, found that the paper stock used for the letter had a watermark that did not appear in commercial production until 2 years after the letter was allegedly written. The paper itself hadn't existed when Thomas Whitmore was supposed to have used it. Clara sat in Hale's office and read that section of the report 3 times. The paper. Edgar had forged a letter on paper that hadn't been manufactured yet. It was the kind of error that spoke to a particular quality of arrogance, the assumption that no one would look closely enough, or know enough, or care enough to trace something as mundane as the composition of the page itself. He'd underestimated the examiner. He'd underestimated Gear. He'd underestimated, Clara thought, the accumulative effect of underestimating people. The civil filing was formally withdrawn yesterday, Hale said, watching her read. Collier sent notice by telegram. He also sent a separate communication to my office indicating that he is cooperating with the territorial investigation in a personal capacity. Clara looked up. He's giving evidence against Edgar. He's protecting his license, Hale said, which was the same thing said differently. His name is on the Meridian registration. If the investigation concludes and he hasn't cooperated, his exposure is criminal as well as professional. He's made a calculation. What does that mean for the case? Hale was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care he always brought to things that were about to be definitive. It means Gear now has a cooperating witness with direct knowledge of the internal structure of Meridian. It means the timeline of the fraud, the decision-making, the division of proceeds. All of that becomes documented through Collier's testimony rather than inferred from external evidence. He paused. It means Edgar is exposed at a level that external documentation alone couldn't achieve. The room was very still. How long before charges? She asked. Gear estimates 8 to 10 weeks before the territorial prosecutor has enough to file formally. The cooperating witness status needs to be structured properly, and the multi-territory aspect adds procedural complexity. Hale looked at her steadily. But the direction is no longer uncertain. Clara sat back in her chair. She'd been sitting forward without realizing it, the way she did when she was reading something closely, and the shift backward felt like releasing something she'd been holding for months. The other families, she said, Webb, Alderman, the others, what happens to them? The criminal case, if it proceeds to conviction, opens the door to a civil restitution claim by affected parties. It's not automatic, and it's not guaranteed, and the amounts recovered would depend on what assets can be attached. He folded his hands on the desk. But the legal pathway exists. Gear's office will notify all affected parties formally when the charges are filed. Frances Alderman has the original survey, Clara said, the one that documents what was taken from her property. If she submits that as part of a restitution claim, she would have strong grounds, Hale said. Yes. Clara thought about Webb's letter with the shaking handwriting, about Frances Alderman writing in her brisk, combative style about 2 years of stored anger with nowhere to go, about the Marsh widow who had died not knowing that she'd been right to be suspicious, right to feel the wrongness of it, right in every way that mattered. She couldn't fix the ones who were gone, but she could make sure that the ones who were here knew that what had been done to them was being named and documented and placed in the public record where it couldn't be quietly erased. She wrote to Webb and Alderman and the 3 others who had responded the same day Gear's report arrived. Not the formal letters that Gear's office would send. Those would come in their own time with the proper territorial language. These were personal. She wrote them herself, not Wyatt, because this part was hers. She told them the forged letter had been exposed. She told them Collier had turned. She told them the timeline Gear had given her and what it meant for the formal case. She told them what Hale had said about restitution and what the pathway looked like, and she was careful to be honest about the uncertainty, that it was a pathway, not a guarantee, and that the law moved slowly and sometimes stopped. She told them she was sorry it had taken this long for someone to connect the pieces. She told them their willingness to write had mattered, that without their statements, the case against Edgar would have been harder to build and slower to develop, that the weight of 5 voices saying the same thing about the same man and the same methods had done exactly what she'd hoped it would do. She sealed the letters and gave them to the postwriter and went back to the ranch and did not feel, as she'd expected to, the particular satisfaction of resolution. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated, a kind of grief for all the time it had taken, a residue of anger that had nowhere to go now that the immediate target had been removed. The strange flatness that settles in when you have been oriented toward a fight for so long that stopping, even successfully, leaves you briefly without direction. Mara found her in the kitchen that evening, sitting with cold coffee and no documents in front of her, which was unusual enough to be notable. "It's almost over," Mara said. It wasn't a question. "Almost," Clara said. Mara sat down. She didn't say anything for a while. She had that quality that Clara had come to appreciate deeply, the ability to be present without requiring the presence to mean something conversational. "I keep thinking about the Marsh widow," Clara said after a while. "Who is she?" "One of the families in Fitch's records. She lost 30 acres in 1874 through the same scheme. She died 2 years later." Clara turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I never knew her. She's just a name in a file with a date of death in the margin." She paused. "But she fought it. Fitch's records show she filed a complaint with the land office in 1875. It went nowhere. Nobody connected it to Meridian, nobody saw the pattern, but she filed it. She knew something was wrong and she said so even when nobody listened." Mara was quiet. "I want to make sure her name is in the record," Clara said. "When Gear files the charges, when the pattern is documented, I want her complaint from 1875 to be cited. I want someone to have written down that she knew first, and she said so." "Then you should tell Gear that," Mara said. "I will." Mara got up and poured the cold coffee out and put fresh coffee on without being asked. She came back to the table and sat down again. "You came here with nothing but a plan," Mara said. "You know that's not a small thing." "I came here with a legal strategy and a folder of documents," Clara said. "You came here with yourself," Mara said, firmly enough that Clara looked up. "The strategy was built out of you. The documents were evidence you found because you knew where to look and what to look for, because your father taught you and you paid attention, because you are the kind of person who reads things carefully and keeps copies and doesn't accept being told you're wrong when you know you're not." She looked at Clara steadily. "That's not a folder. That's a person." Clara held the older woman's gaze and said nothing for a moment because there wasn't anything that could be said that wouldn't diminish it. "Thank you," she said finally. "Don't thank me," Mara said. "I'm right." She rode to Billings 2 weeks later, as planned, and met with Harker at the mill. He was a heavy-set man in his late 40s with flour on his coat and the distracted alertness of someone managing a complex operation who has learned to give each thing exactly the attention it requires and not 1 second more. He looked at Clara across his desk with the particular assessment of a man who has been in business long enough to know that the person who walks through his door is rarely what they look like at first, and usually what their numbers look like on paper. Her numbers were good. She'd spent 3 evenings with the survey maps and the timber assessment data and Wyatt's knowledge of the Lone Ridge cedar to build a projection that was honest rather than optimistic. She'd built in weather delays, disease risk, market variation. And the honest numbers were still good. The Clearwater stand was mature and ready. The species composition was exactly what Harker had said he wanted, but hadn't been able to source consistently. The combined operation she was proposing, with cedar from Lone Ridge supplementing the fir larch from Clearwater on a shared transport schedule, gave Harker 2 different products from one supplier relationship, which simplified his sourcing considerably. He asked hard questions. She answered them directly, including the ones she didn't have complete answers to, where she said so and told him what she knew and what she was still determining. After 90 minutes, he sat back and looked at her. "The Clearwater property," he said. "It's yours, free of any encumbrance?" "There's a pending territorial investigation into a fraudulent claim against it," she said, because she was not going to build a business relationship on incomplete information. "The investigation is proceeding toward criminal charges, not toward any challenge to my ownership. The civil claim against the property was formally withdrawn 3 weeks ago. The territorial investigator can provide documentation of the current status if you need it for your records." He looked at her for a moment. "You just told me the thing that most people would have left out," he said. "Because you'd find it anyway," she said. "And because if we're going to have a contract relationship, you need to know that I don't manage information strategically with people I'm doing business with. I manage it accurately." He was quiet for a moment. 6-month trial contract, he said. First delivery in September, if your first harvest is ready by then. If the grade is consistent with what you've shown me in the sample data, we discuss a longer arrangement in January. She looked at him evenly. I'd want the trial contract to specify the grade standards in writing rather than leaving them to discussion at renewal. He almost smiled. You have a lawyer? I have a good one. Bring him to the contract meeting. He stood and held out his hand. 2 weeks. We'll have the draft ready. She shook his hand and left the mill and stood on the Billings Street in the spring afternoon light and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The clean, forward-facing feeling of something beginning rather than something being defended. She let herself have it for a full minute before she went to find her horse. The formal charges came 9 weeks later, in early summer. Edgar Voss and Warren Collier were charged by the territorial prosecutor with multiple counts of fraud in connection with land transactions across Montana and Dakota territories. Silas Crow, whose cooperation with Geer's investigation had apparently been secured earlier and more quietly than Clara had known, was charged with a reduced set of counts in exchange for his full testimony on the operational structure of Meridian Land and Development. The charges were a matter of public record, which meant they were in the Harlan County paper the following Thursday. And that paper was read by everyone in Harlan County in the particular avid way that people read about the exposure of something they suspected but couldn't prove. Clara read the notice in the paper at the kitchen table at Lone Ridge and felt, again, not what she'd expected. Not triumph, not vindication. Something more like a door closing. The specific, slightly anticlimactic sound of a thing ending that you've been working toward so long that its completion is both satisfying and strangely ordinary. She folded the paper and set it down. Wyatt was across the table, reading his own section of the paper, and he looked up when she set it down. There it is, he said. There it is, she agreed. He went back to his paper. She went back to her coffee. The morning went on around them in its ordinary way, and that ordinariness was, she thought, its own kind of answer. There had been a time, not long ago, when ordinary mornings were not something she'd been sure she would have, when the future had been a thing she'd had to fight for rather than simply walk into. She hadn't quite realized, in the middle of the fighting, how much energy it took to live inside that kind of uncertainty. You didn't notice the weight until you set it down. She was noticing it now. She told Geer about the Marsh widow the week after the charges were filed, in a meeting at Hale's office where they were reviewing the affected party notification process. She said she wanted the 1875 Land Office complaint to be formally cited in the case documentation, not as evidence, since it had been dismissed and added nothing evidentiary to what they already had, but as a matter of historical record, as an acknowledgement that someone had seen this and said so years before anyone listened. Geer looked at her across the desk. It won't change the case, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking for it to change the case. I'm asking for it to be in the record. He was quiet for a moment. Why? She thought about how to say it. Because she was right, she said. And she was alone, and nobody believed her, and she died without knowing that it mattered that she'd said something. She paused. The record is the only place we can put that now. I want her name in it. Geer looked at her for a long time with those careful, measuring eyes. I'll see what can be done, he said. 3 weeks later, he sent her a copy of the amended documentation. The 1875 complaint was cited in the introduction to the case summary, with a note from Geer's office acknowledging it as an early and unacknowledged report of the fraudulent activity. The Marsh widow's name, her full name, Eleanor Grace Marsh, was in the record. Clara folded the copy and kept it. The cedar planting happened in the fall, as planned. They started on a Saturday in early October, when the ground was still workable, but the nights were cold enough to set roots without the stress of summer heat. Wyatt had ordered the seedlings from a nursery in the Bitterroot Valley, and they arrived in burlap-wrapped bundles that smelled of sap and soil and something green that was almost spring even in autumn. There were 4 of them for it: Clara, Wyatt, Elias, and Mara. 4 people on the northern boundary of Lone Ridge with seedlings and spades, working a grid that Wyatt had laid out and Clara had adjusted. She'd moved the eastern rows 6 feet north based on her reading of the drainage pattern, and Wyatt had looked at her revision for a moment and then said, "You're right," and moved his stakes. It was slow work. Each seedling required a specific depth and a specific soil composition around the roots, and there were enough of them that the day was mostly quiet, except for the sound of digging and the occasional direction about spacing. Elias worked at twice the pace of anyone else without appearing to hurry. Mara paused periodically to check the depth of what Clara had planted. Not in a corrective way, but in the way of someone who is doing quality assurance on something that matters. By mid-afternoon, they had the lower third planted. By the time the light started to go, they had the full lower section done. 60 seedlings in even rows on ground that had been cleared and prepared and now looked, to someone who didn't know what they were looking at, like bare earth with sticks in it. To someone who did know what they were looking at, it looked like the beginning of a forest. Clara stood at the edge of the planted section and looked at it. Her back ached. Her hands had blisters where the spade handle had found skin she hadn't thought to protect. She was cold in the way that comes from working in the open on an October afternoon, the particular cold that settles into you gradually while you're too occupied to notice it, and announces itself all at once when you stop. Wyatt came and stood beside her. He had bark on his coat and dirt on his hands, and he was looking at the planted ground with the particular expression of a man who has looked at the same piece of land for years and is now looking at something different. 5 years, he said, maybe 6, before the first meaningful harvest. I know, she said. You'll be 38, he said. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Is that... He stopped. She looked at him. He was not usually a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. Is that what? She said. He looked at the ground, at the 60 small seedlings standing in their rows, at the light going gold and low over the northern hills. He had the look of a man who has decided to say something and is in the specific difficulty of having decided but not yet begun. Is that the life you want? He said. Here, this. He gestured briefly at the ranch behind them, the planted ground in front of them, the whole of what they'd been building together these past months. I need to ask because I should have asked sooner, and I kept not asking because asking made it real. And if you said no, it would... He stopped again. I've never been good at this part. No, she agreed gently. He looked at her. What? You're not good at this part, she said. You're very good at most things. This is not one of them. He held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man who can't decide whether to be embarrassed or relieved that she's noticed. I'm asking, he said. That's what I'm doing, however badly. She looked at the planted ground. She thought about the question, not whether she wanted it, because she'd known the answer to that for a while now, but whether she was ready to say it directly, which was its own different question. She'd spent years being careful about what she said directly and what she held back, because saying something directly had consequences, and consequences had to be managed, and she was good at managing them. But there was a cost to that too, a slow cost, paid out over time in the currency of things not said. Yes, she said, this is the life I want. He said nothing for a moment. The Clearwater operation, and the Cedar, and the Harker contract, and whatever comes after that, she said, and this ranch, and these people. She paused. And you. Yes. He was very still beside her. Then, without any particular drama, without anything that could be called a gesture or a moment in the way that stories made moments, he reached over and took her hand. Just that. Just his hand around hers, both of them cold from the afternoon's work, standing at the edge of a cedar planting in early October with the light going and their backs aching and 4 months of difficulty behind them and a great deal of ordinary time ahead. She held his hand and did not say anything else, and neither did he. The wind came up from the north and moved through the bare branches at the property line, and the first of the stars appeared over the eastern hills, and somewhere behind them Elias and Mara were walking back toward the house. And the 60 cedar seedlings stood in their rows in the ground, too small to move in the wind yet, too new, too just begun, but there. The trial, when it came, was in February. Clara testified for 3 hours on a Tuesday, answering questions from the territorial prosecutor in the careful, precise way she'd been preparing for since Gear first opened his files. She had her father's letters with her. She had the examiner's report. She had her 3 pages from memory, which the prosecutor entered into evidence as demonstrating her direct and expert knowledge of Thomas Whitmore's authentic correspondence. Collier testified for 2 days. He did not look at Edgar during his testimony. Edgar sat at the defendant's table and looked at the front of the room and said nothing that Clara could hear from where she sat. She watched him when she wasn't on the stand, not obsessively, not with any particular emotion, but with the even attention of someone who is making sure they see a thing clearly. He looked diminished in the courtroom the way he had in the ranch yard that Friday afternoon, smaller than his actions had been. The machine he'd built was larger than he was. Most machines are. The man who ran it, taken out of the structure that gave him leverage, was just a man who had made a long series of choices and was now in a room where those choices were being laid out in sequence for a judge and jury. There was something useful in seeing that, something she hadn't expected. She'd been afraid, somewhere underneath everything else, that confronting Edgar in a formal setting would make him large again, would restore whatever authority or menace she'd spent months dismantling in her own mind. Instead, it made him small in a way that was neither satisfying nor particularly sad, just accurate. He was the size he'd always been. The fear she'd felt had been about what he could take, not about him. I was convicted on 11 of the 14 counts in the second week of March. Collier, with his cooperating witness arrangement, received a suspended sentence and the permanent loss of his law license. Crow was convicted on 3 counts, with a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. The sentencing hearing was a month later. Clara did not attend. She had the Harker contract review that week, and the first delivery of Clearwater timber was 2 months out, and there were things that needed her attention that were more important than watching the end of something she'd already watched end in her own mind. She got the news from Hale by letter. She read it once, set it on the desk, and went back to what she'd been doing. Whoa. The letters to the affected families were harder to write than any of the others. She wrote them in April, when the restitution process was formally opened and Gear's office sent the official notifications. She wrote separate personal letters alongside the official ones, not to explain the process, which the official letters did, but to say what the process didn't say. She wrote to Frances Alderman and told her that her original survey had been entered into evidence and that it had mattered, and that the judge had specifically noted it in his findings as documentation of the fraudulent boundary alteration. She told her that the record now showed clearly what had been done to her, and that it was in the public record of a territorial court and would not be erased. She wrote to Horatio Webb and told him his instinct had been right, that something had been wrong, that he had not been confused or foolish, and that his testimony had been part of what made the case against Edgar unambiguous. She wrote to the others, each letter different, each one trying to say the particular thing that that specific person needed to hear based on what she knew of them from their letters and Gear's files. She did not tell them that everything would be made right because she was not going to make promises on behalf of a legal process she didn't control. The restitution claims would take time and their outcomes were not certain. Some of them would recover something and some of them might not, and she wasn't going to soften that reality with language that would make her feel better for having written it. What she could tell them was the truth, that they had been seen and believed, and that the record of what happened to them existed now in a place where it couldn't be quietly unmade. She told Wyatt about the letters one evening, not because she needed to, but because she'd learned slowly and imperfectly that sharing the weight of something didn't mean giving it to someone else. It just meant not carrying it in the dark alone. He listened. He didn't try to fix anything, because there wasn't anything to fix, and he seemed to understand that. "My mother never got a letter like that," he said after. "No," she said. "She deserved one." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it help, sending them?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "It felt like the right thing. That's not the same as knowing if it helps." He nodded. "That's honest." "I'm trying to be." Summer came the way Montana summers always came. Suddenly, after a spring that had taken too long, as if the land had been holding its breath and finally let it go all at once. The Clearwater operation opened in June. The first crew Clara hired was 3 men, 2 experienced timber cutters who'd worked the northern forest country for years and came recommended by a mill contractor Harker knew, and a young man named Dawes who was 19 and had more enthusiasm than technique, but paid attention and didn't argue when she showed him a better way to do something. She managed the operation herself. She was on the Clearwater property 4 days a week through June and July, supervising the selective harvest her father had planned and she had refined, making decisions about which stands to take and which to leave for next season's growth, keeping the grade records that Harker's contract specified. The work was hard in the straightforward physical way that she found easier to manage than the months of legal and investigative difficulty. It had clear metrics. You cut, or you didn't. The wood was the grade it was. The delivery was on time or it wasn't. There was a relief in that clarity after months of fighting over documents and timelines and the ambiguous shifting terrain of what could be proved and what could be implied. Wyatt came to Clearwater on Fridays after the week's ranch work was settled, and they rode the property together in the late afternoon after the crew left. He was learning the Clearwater land the way she'd learned Lone Ridge, by writing it repeatedly, by asking about specific features, by being curious rather than assuming. She liked watching him learn it. She hadn't expected to like it as much as she did. The first delivery to Harker's Mill went out the third week of July. 23 loads of mixed fire and larch, consistent grade, 3 days ahead of the contracted schedule because she'd built in contingency she didn't end up needing. Harker's Mill agent sent a receipt and a note. The note said the grade was as represented and delivery was ahead of schedule, and Harker would be in touch about the January contract discussion. She showed the note to Wyatt that evening. He read it and handed it back without comment, which by now she understood was his highest form of approval. In August, Mara came to find her in the ranch office late on a Thursday afternoon, which was unusual enough that Clara looked up immediately. "There's someone at the gate," Mara said. "A woman, old. She says her name is Alderman." Clara stood up. Frances Alderman was smaller in person than she'd been in Clara's imagination, which had constructed her from the combative energy of her letters as someone of correspondingly large physical presence. She was perhaps 5'2", with white hair and sharp eyes, and the look of someone who had driven a considerable distance and was not going to let that inconvenience her demeanor. She was standing in the yard holding the reins of a wagon horse, and she looked at Clara when Clara came out and said, without preamble, "I came to see the person who wrote me that letter." "I'm Clara Callahan," Clara said. Frances Alderman looked at her. "The letter said my survey mattered. I wanted to know that from a face, not a page." Clara looked at this woman who had kept a survey document for 2 years in the belief that it might someday be useful, who had driven however far she'd driven to hear in person what a letter had already told her. "It mattered," Clara said. "It's in the court record. It'll be there as long as the record is kept." Frances looked at her for a long moment. "Good," she said. And then, slightly less firmly, "I don't know if I'll get anything from the restitution. The lawyer they sent me said it could go either way." "It could," Clara said honestly. "I don't know the outcome." Frances nodded slowly. "But the record says what happened." "Yes." "All right then." Frances turned and began tying her horse to the post by the gate. "I assume you have coffee." "We do," Clara said. "Then I'll come in for a while," Frances Alderman said, and came through the gate and walked up the porch steps like she'd been there before. Like she was someone who had learned long ago that you walked into places where you had a right to be as though you already knew you were welcome. Clara held the door and watched her go in and thought that she had been right about this woman from the first letter. There were people who fought and people who gave up and people who waited in the specific patient way of someone who understood that waiting wasn't the same as acceptance, who kept the document, who stayed in the house, who were still standing when the moment finally came. Frances Alderman was one of those people. There were more of them than the world generally acknowledged. The cedar seedlings were 18 inches tall by the time the first snow came, taller than Wyatt had predicted, which Clara noted with the private satisfaction she kept for occasions when her adjustments to his projections proved correct. She didn't say anything about it. He noticed her not saying anything about it and knew what it meant, which was its own form of communication that she was still getting used to. The shorthand that develops between two people who have spent enough time in the same rooms and on the same land that they've begun to know the things the other person isn't saying. There were worse things to know about a person. They walked the northern boundary together on the first Sunday in November, after a light snow that had left everything quiet and defined. The edges of things sharp in the white light, the planted rows of cedar visible as small dark lines in the clean snow. They walked slowly. There was no urgency. The week's work was done, and the land was resting in its winter way, and there was nothing that needed to be managed right now, which was a condition so unusual that both of them had taken several minutes to recognize it and settle into it. "Frances got her restitution claim approved," Clara said. Partial recovery. Hale sent me the notice. How much? 60% of the appraised value of the 30 acres. It's not everything. She paused. But it's something she can use. Wyatt nodded. He was looking at the cedar rose. Webb? He asked. Still pending. Gear thinks it'll be approved, but the timeline is longer because the acreage was larger and there's more to assess. But it's moving. It's moving, she agreed. They walked on. The snow compressed softly under their boots. The line of the hills to the north was sharp against a sky that was the pale clear blue of winter, and the cedar seedlings stood in their rows, small and dark, and quietly there, 18 months of growth showing in their height above the snow. She thought about her father, not with the particular ache she'd carried for 2 years after his death, which had had grief in it, and also anger, and also the complicated residue of someone who has been left alone to manage what they inherited. She thought about him the way you think about people when enough time has passed, that the shape of them comes back more clearly than the loss. His handwriting and his shorthand for the timber property, and the way he'd taught her to read a document from the bottom up as well as the top down, because the most important information was often in the fine print at the end. He would have liked Wyatt, she thought. Not immediately. Thomas Whitmore had not liked people immediately, as a general rule. But over time, in the accumulative way of two people who both understood the value of work and honesty and land managed for the long term. He would have liked this. What she was building, he would have recognized it. There were things she was still figuring out. The ranch accounts needed an overhaul that she'd been putting off for 2 months. The Harker contract review in January was going to require detailed projections she hadn't finished. She had a letter to draft for Gear's office about the formal citation of the Marsh widow's complaint, following up on something he'd promised to look into and hadn't yet resolved. There were fence posts on the south line that needed addressing before deep winter, and the new hire for the Clearwater crew that she'd been meaning to post about and kept postponing. There was always more. There would always be more. That was what building something meant. Not the absence of problems, but the particular quality of problems that came from having something worth managing, something that made demands because it was alive and growing and real. She could live with that. She was in fact living with it, and finding that it suited her in the way that things suited you when they matched the actual shape of who you were rather than the shape other people thought you should want. Wyatt stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were at the far corner of the cedar planting, where the northern boundary met the property line, and from here you could see the full sweep of the ranch behind them and the planted rows stretching south in their neat lines. And beyond that, the house with smoke coming from the chimney and the light already on in the kitchen, because Mara had started dinner and Elias would be in from the barn soon. It was a whole thing, a complete thing, not finished. Nothing that was worth building was ever really finished, but whole in the way that mattered. "We should get back," Wyatt said, "before it gets full dark." "Yes," she agreed. But they stood there for one more minute first, in the cold and the quiet, and the last of the afternoon light, looking at what they'd made, what they were making, what was growing slowly in the ground they'd chosen together. Then they turned and walked back through the snow toward the warm light in the window, and the sound of their footsteps was the only sound in all that clean white silence. And the cedar seedlings stood behind them in their rows, growing toward something neither of them would live to see fully. But that would be there, standing, long after both of them were gone, in the ground they'd put down their roots.